On the mansion lawn, a pregnant woman stood in a stained dress, as an older man placed his coat over her shoulders. Someone had weighed her worth against his contract. But what kind of announcement makes a husband lose everything he thought he had secured? Ruth, wait. Dean's hand closed lightly around his wife's elbow, just before they reached the open gates of the Westbridge estate. It was not a harsh grip. Dean never did anything harsh when other people might be watching. But it was firm enough to stop her. Ruth Callahan turned toward him, one hand resting under the curve of her belly. The evening air on the edge of Chicago had that early fall coolness that made every breath feel clean, and for a moment she was grateful for it. The ride over had been quiet, except for Dean checking his phone, clearing his throat, and smoothing the front of his suit, as if one wrinkle could ruin their future. Beyond the gates, the Westbridge Anniversary Gala glowed across the lawn. Men in dark suits moved beneath white tents. Women with polished hair lifted glasses and laughed softly. Somewhere near the garden, a string trio played music that sounded too careful to be joyful. Dean looked past Ruth toward the house, then back at her. "I just need tonight to go well," he said. Ruth gave him a tired smile. "I know. No, Ruth, I mean, really well." His voice dropped. "These people aren't like the hospital board dinners. They don't want heavy stories. They don't want details about struggling mothers or postpartum rooms or anything too raw." She blinked once, slowly. "My work is raw, Dean. I'm not saying it isn't important." He softened his face, the way he did when he wanted disagreement to sound like support. "I'm saying there's a way to talk about it. Keep it hopeful. Simple. Something people can feel good about." Ruth looked down at his hand still on her elbow. Then she looked back at the bright lawn. She had come because he had asked, because Dean had spent weeks telling her this invitation could change everything. A long-term legal advisory role with Westbridge would mean security, better clients, the kind of respect he had been chasing since law school. And Ruth, who had watched him sit at the kitchen table after midnight, with contracts spread beside cold coffee, had wanted to believe this night mattered for both of them, so she nodded. "I'll be careful," she said. Dean exhaled as if she had just removed a stone from his chest. "Thank you. And if anyone asks about the pregnancy, just smile. Don't make it the whole conversation." Ruth's hand tightened over her belly, then relaxed. Their child gave a turn under her pom-pom, a quiet reminder that not everything about her could be arranged for public comfort. A young attendant checked their invitation at the entrance. Dean handed it over before Ruth could reach into her clutch, and the cream-colored card passed from his fingers like a key. Westbridge Foundation Anniversary Gala. Even the paper looked expensive. Inside the gates, Dean changed. His shoulders straightened. His smile widened. His nervousness did not disappear, but it dressed itself in charm. He guided Ruth through the receiving line, with a hand at her back, introducing her as "My wife Ruth," then moving quickly to whatever name mattered next. Ruth followed, smiling when expected, shaking hands when offered, answering the same gentle questions about when the baby was due, and whether she planned to keep working. She said little about the hospital. She said even less about the women she remembered most. The ones who counted bus fare after discharge. The ones who apologized for crying. The ones who asked if feeling empty made them bad mothers. Those were not garden party stories. Near the edge of the lawn, Dean spotted a cluster of men in tailored suits, beside a tall woman with silver blonde hair and a smooth, commanding smile. His posture changed again. "That's Patricia Mercer," he murmured. Ruth followed his gaze. Patricia stood as though the entire event had been built around the direction of her chin. People leaned in when she spoke. They waited before laughing, as if her approval gave them permission. Dean touched Ruth's arm. "Just let me lead this one." There it was again. "Let me lead. Be careful. Keep it hopeful." "Smile." Ruth said nothing as they approached. Patricia turned before Dean spoke, as if she had known they were coming. "Dean Callahan," she said warmly. "There you are." Dean's face lit with relief. "Mrs. Mercer, thank you for having us. This is my wife Ruth." Patricia's eyes moved to Ruth's belly, then to her face. The smile remained, but something in it sharpened. "Ruth." "The nurse." Ruth extended her hand. "It's nice to meet you." Patricia took it with both of hers, a gesture that looked intimate from a distance and felt measured up close. "Dean has told us so much about you. Your work with mothers, your years at the hospital, all that quiet service." She paused just long enough. "How moving." The word landed strangely. Not cruel, not yet. But Ruth had heard that tone before, usually from people who liked compassion best when it could be framed, printed, and placed in front of donors. Dean answered before Ruth could. She's very dedicated. I can see that, Patricia said. Her gaze dropped again to Ruth's hand on her belly, and now a mother herself. How perfect, Ruth felt Dean shift beside her. It was a small movement, but she knew him well enough to hear the warning in it. Don't complicate this. Patricia looked over her shoulder toward the lawn. We'll have to make sure you meet a few of our board members tonight. People love to hear from someone who has seen the human side of the work. Ruth kept her smile polite. I'm always happy to talk about the women we serve. The women, Patricia repeated, as if tasting the phrase. Yes. Though tonight we try not to make people feel burdened. Donors give more generously when hope is in the room. Dean laughed softly, too quickly. Of course. Absolutely. Ruth did not laugh. For the first time that evening, she wished they had stayed home. She wished she were sitting at their small kitchen table with her shoes off, not standing under strings of warm lights, while strangers decided which parts of her life were suitable for display. Dean leaned close as Patricia turned to greet another guest. You're doing fine, he whispered. The praise should have comforted her. Instead, it made her feel like a child who had managed not to embarrass him. A waiter passed with sparkling water, and Ruth took one glass. The cold rim steadied her. Across the lawn, Patricia spoke to two men near the donor table, then glanced back at Ruth. Not casually, not politely, assessing. Dean saw the look too, and something like eagerness crossed his face. Come on, he said. There are a few people I want you to meet. But Ruth did not move right away. She watched Patricia point lightly in their direction while one of the men nodded. She watched Dean's grip tighten around the invitation card he had never returned to her, and in that small, bright, crowded moment, Ruth understood that her husband was not only nervous about his career. He had brought her here for a reason, and whatever role he had prepared for her, he had not yet told her what it was. Ruth stayed still long enough for Dean to notice. He followed her gaze across the lawn, saw Patricia speaking with the two men by the donor table, and gave Ruth a quick, careful smile. Don't read too much into everything, he said. This is how these events work. That's exactly what worries me, Ruth answered. Dean's smile tightened, but before he could respond, Patricia turned back toward them with the easy timing of someone used to being obeyed. She crossed the cocktail lawn without hurrying, her silver hair smooth under the soft lights, her expression warm enough for anyone watching from a distance. Ruth dear, Patricia said. I was just telling Mr. Ellery and Mr. Vance that you are exactly the kind of person Westbridge exists to honor. Dean stepped a little closer to Ruth's side. That's very kind of you. Ruth looked at Patricia. I'm not sure I've done anything tonight that needs honoring. Oh, that humility, Patricia said, touching Ruth's forearm lightly. That's what people respond to, not titles, not numbers. A human face, the phrase made Ruth's stomach pull tight, though she kept her expression calm. Around them, guests held glasses and small plates, listening with the polite attention rich people gave when they sensed a story might become useful. Ruth had seen that look before in hospital visitors who wanted to be moved, but not disturbed. They liked compassion when it was clean. They liked hardship when it arrived with a beginning, middle, and hopeful ending. Patricia turned Ruth gently toward the men. Dean tells me you've spent years working with mothers who had nowhere else to turn. I've worked with mothers in difficult situations, Ruth said. Most of them would not want to be discussed at a gala. A small pause opened in the circle. Dean gave a soft laugh. Ruth is very protective of her patients, as she should be, Patricia said smoothly, but sometimes the right story opens the right checkbook. That is not exploitation. That is strategy in service of mercy. Ruth's fingers closed around the stem of her water glass. Mercy doesn't need a spotlight to be real. One of the men glanced down into his drink. The other smiled as if Ruth had said something charming but slightly unscripted. Patricia's face did not change, but the warmth in her eyes thinned. Of course, still donors need to feel what their money can do. We try to make the invisible visible. Dean leaned close to Ruth. Patricia has built this foundation from the ground up. Ruth heard the warning under the praise. Agree. Smile. Be easy. From a few feet away, an older woman in a plain dark dress watched the exchange without joining it. Ruth noticed her because she was the only person not pretending the conversation was pleasant. Their eyes met briefly. The woman gave Ruth a small nod, not grand, not dramatic, just enough to say she had heard what others were ignoring. Patricia followed Ruth's glance. Ah, Lorna. One of our community guests, Lorna Beckett, stepped forward. I know Ruth. Ruth searched her face, then remembered a tired woman sitting beside a young mother in a postpartum room, hands folded around a paper cup of coffee. Not a close friend. Not someone from Ruth's daily life, but someone who had seen her work when there had been no donors, no cameras, no applause. You were with your niece, Ruth said. Lorna's mouth softened. You remembered, of course. Patricia gave a light clap of her hands, as if this little recognition had pleased her for reasons of her own. See, this is precisely what I mean. These connections are powerful. Ruth felt the room around her shift, though they were still outside under open sky. She was no longer simply Dean's wife standing on a lawn. She was being positioned. A staff member passed behind Patricia carrying a stack of cream-colored programs for the evening. One slipped free and fluttered to the grass near Ruth's feet. She bent carefully, picked it up, and held it out. Patricia took it, then seemed to reconsider. Keep it, dear. You may want to know when you're needed. Ruth looked down. The program listed the welcome toast, donor recognition, a short film, and then a section called Voices of Hope. Beneath it, in smaller print, was her name, Ruth Callahan, bedside nurse and expecting mother. For a moment, the music and conversation seemed to move away from her. Dean reached for the program. They must have just included a mention. Ruth did not let go. Dean, it's not a big thing. My name is printed here, Patricia's smile held. Only because Dean told us you were open to saying a few words. Nothing formal. Just a moment of gratitude. A woman like you carries more truth than any speech I could give. Ruth turned to her husband. You told them I would speak? Dean looked from Ruth to Patricia and back again. His face had gone slightly pale, but his voice stayed low. I said you might. That's all. That is not all. Can we not do this here? Ruth looked once more at the program. Bedside nurse. Expecting mother. Two labels, neat and harmless, stripped of every hard thing she knew. Patricia touched Dean's sleeve. The stage team is just inside. Dean, perhaps you can help them confirm the order. Ruth can have a moment to breathe. Dean seemed grateful for the escape. Yes, of course. Ruth watched him walk toward the side entrance of the house with Patricia, speaking quickly now, his head bent toward hers. Lorna stayed behind, quiet. You don't have to let them make you smaller, Lorna said. Ruth looked at her. Before Ruth could answer, a staff member came out through the side door holding his folder. Mr. Callahan left this with the stage notes, she said, looking uncertain. Mrs. Mercer asked that it be kept with the program materials. The folder was not sealed. Ruth saw her own name on the first page before she meant to look. She should have closed it, she knew that. But Dean's handwriting sat in the margin beside the printed schedule, and beneath it was a short note that made her breath stop. Ruth will provide a brief personal story during Voices of Hope. Her participation demonstrates family alignment with Westbridge's mission. Advisory agreement to be finalized after Gala. The words were tidy, professional, almost bloodless. Ruth read them twice. Dean had not merely hoped she would behave. He had offered her up in advance. Her silence, her pregnancy, her years beside hospital beds, even the women whose pain she had carried home in the folds of her scrubs. All of it had been turned into a step on his ladder. Lorna saw Ruth's face change. Honey? Ruth closed the folder carefully and held it against the program. Across the lawn, Dean looked back at her. Patricia stood beside him near the small stage, smiling as two staff members adjusted the microphone. Ruth understood then that the evening had never needed her as herself. It needed a soft voice, a round belly, and a grateful woman willing to make wealthy people feel generous. For the first time that night, Ruth stopped worrying about embarrassing her husband. She looked at the stage, then at the printed name in her hand, and realized that in a few minutes she would have to choose. Protect Dean's dream, or refuse to become Westbridge's story. The printed program trembled slightly in Ruth's hand. Though she made herself stand still, across the lawn, the small stage was nearly ready. A staff member tested the microphone with 2 soft taps, and the sound carried over the polite murmur of the guests. Heads turned, glasses lowered, and people began drifting toward the open space in front of the platform. Dean returned first. He saw the folder against Ruth's chest. His face changed before he could hide it. "Ruth," he said under his breath, "please don't make this harder than it has to be." She looked at him for a long second kind. "You promised them I would speak," I said. "You might help." His eyes flicked toward Patricia, then back to Ruth. "There's a difference." "No, Dean, there isn't." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This is not the time. That's what you keep saying whenever the truth is inconvenient." His jaw tightened. "I am trying to build something for us." Ruth held up the program. "By handing them my name?" Before Dean could answer, Patricia glided toward them with the soft certainty of someone arriving to collect what already belonged to her. "Wonderful," she said, smiling at the guests gathering near the stage. "Everyone is moving into place. Ruth, dear, we'll keep this very simple. You'll stand beside me. I'll introduce you. Then you can say a few words about what Westbridge means to mothers like you and the women you serve." Ruth did not move. Patricia's smile stayed in place. Just from the heart, Dean touched Ruth's back, a silent push more than comfort. "It'll be 2 minutes." Ruth turned her head toward him. "You don't get to decide that." The words were not loud, but they landed hard enough that Dean pulled his hand away. Patricia's eyes sharpened. "I'm sorry?" Ruth faced her. The stage lights reflected off the polished microphone behind Patricia's shoulder. That small black stem, waiting for her voice, suddenly looked less like an invitation than a trap. "I won't speak tonight," Ruth said. A few guests nearby quieted. Patricia gave a light laugh, the kind meant to smooth over a crack before anyone could see it. "Nerves are very normal, especially in your condition. My condition has nothing to do with it." Dean inhaled sharply. "Ruth," she kept her eyes on Patricia, "the women I care for are not material for a fundraising moment. Their pain doesn't belong on that stage, just because it makes people feel generous." The small circle around them went still. For the first time that evening, Patricia's warmth disappeared. "How disappointing," she said softly. "I had hoped you understood the purpose of tonight." "Do," Ruth said. "That's why I'm saying no." Patricia looked past her, toward the donors now watching with open curiosity. Then, she turned back, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentle enough for the crowd to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, forgive the delay. Our guest seems to be overwhelmed." A few sympathetic murmurs moved through the guests. Ruth felt them glance at her belly first, then her face, as if pregnancy made her refusal less real. Patricia continued, still smiling. "That is often the challenge when people from the front lines are invited into rooms like this. They carry so much feeling. Sometimes too much." Ruth's cheeks warmed, but she stood her ground. "She isn't overwhelmed," Lorna said from behind her. Patricia glanced at the older woman as if noticing a chair out of place. "Lorna, this is not necessary. It is if you're going to speak for her." Dean leaned toward Ruth again, panic showing now. "Stop this. You're embarrassing yourself." That hurt more than Patricia's voice. Ruth turned to him. For one small, foolish second, she still waited for him to see her. Not the program. Not the advisory role. Not the donors, her. But Dean's eyes were on the stage. Patricia took that moment and used it. "You must understand," she said to the crowd. "Westbridge has always believed in dignity. We invite real people here because stories matter. But gratitude, like service, requires grace." The word gratitude passed over the lawn like a command. Ruth felt the guests looking at her now, not as a nurse, not as a woman, not as Dean's wife, but as a problem, a difficult woman, a woman who had been given a lay and room and refused to stand where she was told. Dean's face disflushed. "Ruth, apologized," he whispered. She stared at him. "For what?" "For making this ugly." Something inside her went very quiet. Patricia folded the program in her hand. "Dean, I'm sorry. I can see this has put you in an impossible position." He turned to Patricia immediately. "No, please, I'll handle it." Ruth heard those words, and whatever fragile hope remained in her finally gave way. "Not I'm sorry, Ruth. Not she has a right to say no. I'll handle it." Dean stepped in front of her slightly, as if shielding Patricia from his wife. "She's tired. She's been emotional lately. With the baby and work, she takes everything personally." Ruth's hand went to her belly. The child moved beneath her palm, small and certain. Patricia gave Dean a look of practiced pity. "You're very patient." "I'm trying," he said. Lorna made a sound under her breath, but Ruth did not look back. Her eyes stayed on Dean. He had chosen, not in anger, not by accident. He had chosen calmly, publicly, in the language of a man protecting his future from his wife. The crowd began to murmur again. Someone near the donor table looked away. Another guest lifted a glass and pretended not to listen. The silence around Ruth was not empty. It was full of people deciding that her discomfort was less important than the smooth continuation of the evening.
Patricia turned toward the. We'll proceed without the personal remarks then. The announcement cannot wait.
The announcement. Ruth caught the phrase. She saw Dean's eyes flash toward Patricia, urgent and afraid. Whatever Westbridge planned to say tonight, it mattered enough that they were willing to swallow the scene and keep moving. Ruth stepped back from the circle. Dean reached for her. "Where are you going?" She did not answer. If she spoke then her voice might break, and she would not give them that. She moved past the last row of guests, past the bright spill of the stage lights, toward the darker edge of the lawn, where the air was colder, and the music sounded far away. Lorna followed a few steps, then stopped, giving her space. Ruth stood near a line of trees, one hand on her belly, the other inside her small purse. Her fingers found her phone. For a moment, she looked back. Patricia was already at the microphone. Dean stood near the stage, pale and rigid, watching the donors instead of watching her. The program still lay folded in Patricia's hand. Ruth unlocked her phone and found the number she had not planned to call tonight. Malcolm Tate answered after the second ring.
"Ruth?"
She closed her eyes just long enough to steady herself. "Malcolm," she said, her voice low but clear. "They're about to announce Westbridge as the recipient." A pause came through the line, then Malcolm's voice changed. Calm, but no longer gentle. "Are you safe?" Ruth looked at the stage, at the microphone, at the room full of people waiting to applaud themselves. "But you need to come now." The applause began before Ruth could hang up. It came from the lawn behind her, polished and obedient, the kind of applause that rose because people saw others clapping and did not want to be the last to join. Patricia stood at the microphone, beneath the warm stage lights, one hand resting on the folded program, as if the evening had never broken open. Dean stood near the steps of the stage, his face stiff, his eyes searching the edge of the lawn where Ruth had gone. Ruth lowered the phone from her ear. Her hand stayed on her belly. She was hurt, but she was no longer waiting to be rescued by the man who had already chosen the room over her. Patricia's voice carried clearly through the speakers. "Tonight, Westbridge is honored to announce the final commitment that will allow us to expand our maternal care initiative across the region." Another wave of applause rose. Ruth took one step toward the stage, then stopped. A low sound rolled over the estate. At first the guests looked toward the road, confused. The sound grew stronger, cutting through the music, the applause, the careful speeches. Napkins lifted from the cocktail tables. A few guests covered their ears. Patricia stopped sentence, her smile frozen in place. A medical helicopter came over the dark line of trees and descended toward the wide stretch of grass beyond the tents. People scattered back from the landing area. Dean turned pale. Patricia's hand tightened around the microphone. The helicopter touched down hard enough to send a rush of wind across the lawn. The stage flowers shook. Programs slid from chairs. The bright order of the gala broke into startled movement and silence. The door opened. Malcolm Tate stepped down first, steady despite the wind, with a folder tucked under one arm and a dark coat over the other. He did not rush like a man trying to impress anyone. He walked with the calm of someone who had come to stop a mistake before it became permanent. His eyes found Ruth at once. He crossed the grass to her, ignoring the guests, the stage, and Patricia's sharp voice calling his name. "Ruth," he said. She did not answer. For the first time that night her face almost crumpled. Malcolm placed the coat around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, quiet, and more protective than anything Dean had done all evening. Only then did Ruth breathe. Dean came down from the stage. "What is this?" "Ruth, what did you do?" Malcolm turned toward him. She made the call she should have made. Patricia stepped forward, still trying to hold the room with her posture. "Dr. Tate, this is highly inappropriate. We are in the middle of a foundation announcement." "No," Malcolm said. "You are in the middle of claiming a gift you no longer qualify to receive." The lawn went still. Patricia's voice hardened. "That is not your decision." Malcolm opened the folder and removed a set of papers. He did not wave them around. He simply held them where Patricia could see the foundation seal and the signature lines. The donor's final instructions were clear. The recipient must be approved by the designated beneficiary advisor. That advisor was chosen because she understood the women this money was meant to serve, not as an image, not as a story. As people, Dean looked from the papers to Ruth. Ruth felt his realization arrive before he spoke. It moved across his face slowly, first as confusion, then fear, then the shame of a man discovering he had sold the very person who held the key. Patricia glanced at Ruth. Her? Malcolm's expression did not change. Ruth Callahan, the name crossed the lawn differently this time. Not as Dean's wife. Not as the expecting nurse in a printed program. Not as a soft voice for donors, just Ruth. Lorna stepped out from the crowd. Her hands were clasped in front of her, but her voice was clear. She sat with my niece when no one else had time, Lorna said. She remembered her name. She remembered mine. If that money is meant for mothers, then it belongs with someone who sees them when there isn't a camera in the room. No one clapped. No one moved. The silence was heavier than applause. Patricia tried once more. This foundation has served this community for years, and it may continue serving, Malcolm said. But not with this grant. Not after tonight. Dean turned to Ruth, his voice suddenly soft. Ruth, I didn't know. She looked at him, and there was pain in her eyes, but not confusion. You knew enough, she said. You knew I did not agree. You knew those women were not yours to off, and you knew I was your wife when you asked me to apologize. He opened his mouth. But no defense came that did not sound smaller than the truth. The announcement ended there. Not with shouting, not with security, not with drama worthy of the stage Patricia had built. It ended with a microphone left unused, a folder closed in Malcolm's hands, and Ruth walking away from the lights with his coat around her shoulders. In the weeks that followed, Westbridge released a careful statement. Patricia was removed from her place of authority before sinners settled in. Dean's advisory agreement vanished with the same quiet speed it had once appeared, and the people who had promised to introduce him around stopped returning his calls. He tried to explain himself to Ruth more than once. He said he had been scared. He said he had thought opportunity had to be taken when it came. He said he had done it for their future. Ruth listened the first time. After that, she let silence answer him. The grant did not make her rich. It was never meant to. Under Malcolm's guidance, it became something steadier. A small postpartum care center on a quiet street with soft chairs, warm meals, counseling rooms, and a front desk where no woman had to explain why she was tired before someone believed her. Lorna became one of the first community voices there. She brought letters from women Ruth had once helped, not for display under glass, not for donors to admire, but to remind the staff why the doors mattered. On the morning the center opened, Ruth stood at the entrance with one hand on the door and the other resting over her child. Malcolm waited beside her. Lorna stood just inside, smiling through tears. For a moment, Ruth looked at the clean sign on the wall. It did not call anyone a story. It did not call anyone a symbol. It simply said, "Welcome, mothers." Then Ruth opened the door.